He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 27 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back with another episode, Henry. Today, we have a great guest, is an old friend of mine named Marc Williams, and he's going to share with us his experiences as a senior level creative on the corporate world, something we haven't heard from. So let's take a listen. Henry, we're back with another episode. I'm really delighted to introduce to our viewers a friend of mine, Marc Williams. He and I met in 2018 when I was in New York City doing a workshop for the Association of National Advertisers. He voluntarily chose to sign up for an 8-hour workshop. It's an all-day affair. We dive deep into the creative brief, and we met there, we talked. He was a great participant. He had some astute comments. And I found out that he is also a direct response copywriter. But what draws me to Marc and why I'm so eager to have him on our show today is because he represents a part of our industry that we really haven't had a chance to explore, and that is the corporate creative world. Marc has spent a good chunk of his career on the agency side, and in the last dozen years or so on the corporate side. Now he's a consultant. So we're going to hear some interesting thoughts about corporate creative and the creative brief. Marc Williams, thank you for joining Henry and me on the Brief Brothers.
Thank you, Howard. I really am glad to be here chatting with you guys about one of my favorite topics, which is creative briefs,
All right.
which I'm very passionate about. And it's funny, I didn't know from creative briefs until, I guess it was during the years that I was at Wunderman, which is early to mid 90s. Account planning was really becoming a big thing. It was kind of an import from the UK, and a lot of American agencies were adopting it. And account planners started becoming the new stars in agencies, right? Everybody, it was like this shiny new toy that everybody had to have. And you can, I guess, have a debate about whether or not that was overhyped, but I think that what was not overhyped was the fact that they did this deep dive into customer insights and strategic planning and brand planning, and really trying to understand who customers were, what motivated them, and how you could kind of tap into those motivations to make your communications more effective. And so I'll tell you a funny story. So I'm at Wunderman for 6 years, right? And then I go to Digitas, which was then called Bronner Schlossberg Humphrey. And they just opened an outpost in New York. And I was the first creative director there, after the executive creative director who hired me. And I'll never forget, I said, so creative briefs, do we have any? And people looked at me as if I had 2 heads. And they had not yet gotten the gospel of creative briefs and account planning and strategic planning and all of that. And I'll never forget this. So I had my first kind of tiny assignment for American Express, and I'm sitting with the account person, and she says to me, and I quote, I'm not even kidding, so shall we come up with some insights? And I looked at her and I was like, really, is it that simple? We're just going to kind of make them up on the spot? We don't have any data. We don't have any input from the client. We don't have anything about the customer, but we're just going to kind of make the insights up? I think maybe we shouldn't do that. And it was a running battle, I would say, for about a year or so. But as some of my former Wunderman colleagues began to migrate over to the shiny new agency of Bronner Schlossberg Humphrey, account planning and creative briefs started to take on more and more importance. And I think that as an agency, that's when they began to really take off and really grow the New York office. Now, I'm sure that there are a lot of my former colleagues from the home office in Boston who would take vehement issue with that, but that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So yeah, and the more I spent time with the account planners and the more I listened to their conversations and got some insights into their thought processes, I soon got to the point where I said, how did we ever survive without, as creatives, how did we ever survive without this? Because it seemed to me that you couldn't do anything yes, especially in direct response, there are tactics that you can use to kind of uh, provoke people into a response of one sort or another. We know the tricks and we know how to use them. But in terms of really getting real deep insights into customers that really makes them loyal to a brand, that we didn't have access to. And once account planning really took off, we began to really see like much better, much more effective, much more um, brand powerful kind of communications. And so I've been a big proponent ever since. And when you're in the agency world, you don't have to worry so much about convincing people about the importance of creative briefs and the fact that kind of account planning or brand planning is a very specific discipline that requires a very specific set of talents. But boy, oh boy, go to the corporate side and you are having that same argument all over again.
Well, you've made the transition for me.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Well, I just want to chime in because I think that let's talk about the agency side first and then on the
Sure.
corporate side. I think, I'm a strategist, or what used to be called a planner.
Mhm.
And I, I, you talked about like all of the kind of pomp and circumstance that surrounded the arrival of account planning.
Yeah.
But I think the arrival of account planning, as it was imported from the UK, as you say, I think the importance of it was that previous to account planning or strategy,
Mhm.
a lot of the skill set existed in the agency, except it was in diverse departments throughout.
Right.
So you had the media department might have access to certain consumer data. There might be a research department.
Mhm.
The account people had knowledge of the client's business, and so it was all housed in the agency, but it wasn't embodied in one role.
Right.
To bring it all together, to be kind of that that bottleneck or funnel that would take the important stuff, distill it down, and then get it to the creatives and kind of just manage that without having to worry about the media plan or being the ambassador to the client and all of those things.
Right.
So really I think that the advent of account planning was more one of consolidating existing things into one role, one person on an account.
Yeah.
Um, and in that sense, it was more efficient because you had this person who was specializing in, you know, not just doing research, but like doing research with an eye toward the communication. Like
Yeah.
what is it about this research that we're going to take away that's going to inform our communication? It's not
Right.
just research for the sake of research. Oh, isn't that interesting? No, we found out this thing that could help us in our advertising message.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in terms of the corporate side, I could definitely see where, you know, it would take some persuading to
You're
to
being very diplomatic, Henry.
to get corporate leaders to want to invest more into a role that doesn't have necessarily an output that is visible or
Yeah.
as visible. Like if you're a copywriter, you write copy. If you're an art
Right.
director, you direct art,
Right.
and that has a tangible end product. Um, the strategist role, the brief writer's role, the planner's role is more of a catalyst,
Mhm.
and in that sense, is more of like a cog in the machine that you only really notice once you add it in what the benefit is.
Right. Right. The thing that the thing that is really different about the corporate side is that even when they, sometimes grudgingly will admit to the importance of customer insights and strategic planning, um, they will try to have someone else do that job, somebody other than a strategist, to the point that you were just making. It's like that person is the catalyst. And a lot of times corporate will not want to invest in that kind of personnel because there is no tangible thing like copy or like art. And, an in-house agency kind of fights a running battle anyway, because it's seen as especially in large organizations, it's seen as a cost center and not as a profit center. and nobody has really kind of, straddled the two lines and said, well, actually, it's an investment center. We're going to invest in this in-house agency because it's going to make our brand better and it's going to help our communications be more effective. But it's the rare organization that does that. And so a lot of times, and this has happened in a couple of places I've been, the job of the account planner or the strategist goes to the marketing person, or it goes to the creative director, or it sometimes even goes to somebody that is straddling, project manager and client manager, and and doing those in addition to doing those two things, they might be asked to do the strategic insights as well. And I think that, if and I don't know how you feel about this, Henry, but if I was a planner or a strategist, I would really take umbrage with that, because it takes a very specific set of skills, I think, to be a really good strategist. And I've worked with a lot of really good strategists. I've been very fortunate that way. And I've worked with some that frankly were not so great. But a lot of times when they weren't so great, it wasn't because they were innately not good at the job. It was because they didn't have the set of skills that was necessary to do the job well, and hadn't really been trained how to do it. So of course, how could they do it well?
Yeah.
Yes. So I don't take umbrage. Sorry, I don't take umbrage at that at all. When somebody else is assigned to do it, I recognize that this is the reality. I've said a million times on the show here that, the prime thing that strategists and planners are associated with is creative briefs, but
Right.
I don't write that many creative briefs over the course of a year. But everything else that I'm doing is absorbing information that's going to help me the day that I need to write that brief.
Right.
And what happens in marketing organizations where the writing of the brief is assigned to somebody as an additional task, as opposed to the primary task, is that they just don't have they're not looking at everything the way that a strategist looks at it. Like they're hustling from meeting to meeting, they're handling all of their other responsibilities, and then when they have to write a brief, it's like, okay, now I have to put on my brief writing hat. And that's not really how it works. My brief writing hat is always on, even when I'm not writing a brief, because I know that's the job. But there are certainly bad strategists, and there are certainly very capable project managers, account people that write great briefs, that are, really insightful people. And so there's no, there's more than one way to skin a cat, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I want to hear from you, Mark. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, the thing about the creative brief and, that document, it really depends on what the kind of, I guess, philosophical bent is of the organization that you're working with. That will determine how good a brief you get, right? So for a lot of organizations, because they simply don't know any better, or they haven't been asked to think any differently, it becomes more of a marketing brief checklist, right? With demographic information, and here are my business objectives, and here are how many new accounts I have to have, and how many new customers I have to attract, and all of that kind of thing. But it is usually lacking in insight. And again, it's because, and this, Henry, I'm sure, having written them and having seen, good ones and not so good ones, writing a really good brief that really inspires the creative team to come up with something truly different and truly powerful is a hard thing to do. And yet it's so vital. And a lot of times it's treated as almost as an afterthought. Oh yeah, we have to do a brief, right? Start there.
Well, what you're kind of dancing around, Mark, is a really good point. And that is, in these organizations that you're talking about, whether you work there or not, that treat the brief as an afterthought, is that they don't understand who the audience of the brief really is. They think it's the marketing department. They think it's the sales department. And they forget that the audience of the brief, and Henry and I have talked about this many times, it's the creatives. And when you forget that it's the creatives, you're not writing, it's easier to fall into the lingo, the internal lingo, the marketing speak, and
Yes.
has nothing to do with what creatives are looking for. And creatives become not just an afterthought, but they're not even part of the process.
Right.
The writers don't realize that it's the creatives who have skin in the game. They're the ones who have to be using the document. And when I go out and do my training, I encounter a lot of internal ad agencies at corporate structures.
Hmm.
Sometimes they have strategists. Most of the times they don't.
Right.
And it becomes the marketer's job, as Henry has alluded to, and we've talked about before, to do this dual role.
Yeah.
And it's not uncommon for me to hear marketers say, "Oh yeah, I write the brief. I write it by myself. Sometimes I've given an hour to do it. Sometimes I have a day."
Hmm.
And the creatives see it at the kickoff.
Right.
When it's too late.
Right. Right.
And then it no longer becomes a discussion about what are the opportunities. It's like, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking me to do.
Yeah, yeah. And the byproduct of that is that, a lot of times, because of schedule pressures or because of time pressures or because of, people who are powerful in the organization wanting what they want, you do the work and the work becomes a way of actually getting to the brief versus the brief becoming a way of getting to the work.
And that's something that we've had on our show before. Matt Davies and Peter Paul von Wheeler. They're the strategists in. Well, I think they're located in Australia, but one of them is from the UK, or maybe they're both from the UK. Anyway, they did a global survey,
Hmm.
and I was in New York a week ago, and Mark and I had lunch, and we were talking about this. They surveyed marketers and asked them what they thought about the quality of the briefs that they delivered to the agency.
Right.
And there was a Grand Canyon sized gap in perception. The marketers believed they did a great job. The creatives and the agency said not so much.
Right.
And one of the more shocking, surprising, or maybe not so surprising conclusions that you just alluded to is that they use the creative brief process, the creative process itself, to figure out the strategy.
Yeah.
I'll know the idea. I know the strategy what it is when I want to see it.
Right.
So I want to kind of pivot a little bit and ask you something that's related to an experience that I had. And it might have very well been the training that you and I met in New York.
Okay. Okay.
There was a senior muckety muck, SVP, VP, I'm not sure what her title was, but she was representing one of the banks. It wasn't I believe you were with Chase.
That's correct.
When I met you, she was not from Chase.
Okay.
But she was with another one of these international banks.
Hmm.
And she sat in the back of the room like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I thought, oh man, I've lost her. I'm just not getting through to her. I don't know
Right.
what's wrong. But at our first break, I walked over and introduced myself.
Yeah.
And I said, so what'd you think? What is your take on the training so far? And she said, I love what you're saying. I'm just trying to figure out how I'm going to tell the folks upstairs how do we adapt? How do we make this change to
Right.
get to the principles that you're talking about? And we're basically, anyone who's listened to or watched our show knows what my philosophy is, and it's pretty much aligned with Henry. So I guess my question is, when you first showed up in the corporate job, what were some of the pain points that you encountered around the brief? Let's kind of get real specific here.
Well, here's the thing. My first corporate job was a complete anomaly. And in some ways, it ruined me for every job that followed.
Okay.
So I'll explain what I mean by that.
And I think and if we put this in the context of, there might be folks out there listening and watching this, saying, I want to go into the corporate creative world.
Yeah. I'm getting a lot of those questions now from even my younger colleagues. As a matter of fact, one of my mentees had contacted me this morning because she's got an opportunity with a client-side tech company. And she has not been in agency life that long, but she's already starting to look, outside of working in agencies. And that's because, and this is a completely different topic, but also one worth exploring at some point. Agencies are I think, experiencing a talent drain because it's become a little bit oppressive, and because the workforce is changing their attitudes towards work so much that the agency model of we're going to work you all day and all night and on the weekend, you're going to do it because you're going to be so thrilled to work with us. I think that's kind of going away a bit. In any event, you asked about my first corporate experience.
Yeah, Henry, we'll take note of that topic as a future episode. But yeah, what talk about your first experience and share some lessons.
So my first experience was I had just gotten laid off from my job at Digitas, and this recruiter contacts me and she says, "Listen, I've got this great job for you. It's with Prudential." And I was like, "Prudential? Aren't they an insurance company?" She said, "Yes, Mark, they're an insurance company. And you know what? Just take the meeting. Just take the meeting." So I did. I took the meeting. I took the series of interviews. I really was in a little bit of between a rock and a hard place because I was in that middle ground where, my kids are like on their way to college. It's, there's stuff happening. I've got to
You need a job.
right the ship. I've got to right the ship. I need a job. So I go to Prudential, and much to my great and everlasting surprise and glee, their in-house agency was in fact a full service agency, which means that they had account people and creative people, art directors and copywriters, and data analytics and media. They did all their media buying and planning in-house. And they had a strategy team, and those guys were great. I mean, they were fantastic. I mean, so this agency, and I always say this because I foolishly left them much too soon, about 2.5 years after I started there, which remains one of the biggest mistakes I've made in my career. But in any event, what I discovered was that, if this agency, if you could physically lift it out of Prudential and put it somewhere on Park Avenue or Madison or somewhere in the city, it would function fine because they had all the pieces in place. The senior management had made that commitment, and it really showed up in the work, and it showed up in the creative briefs that I got, because the briefs were, without fail, they were great briefs. They had great strategists. They had made the commitment. Senior management, didn't kind of thumb their noses at, like, what do you need that for? We're not giving you money for that. And they just said, here's, and the guy that ran the agency, the guy named Colin McConnell, who was my boss when I first got there, to his credit, he had enough pull and enough smarts and enough persuasive powers to get them to invest in it. And it really showed up in the work. And to this day remains, probably 2.5 of the best years of my career that I've ever had.
Probably whoever's idea it was to go in-house, right, was enlightened in a certain way, because it's one thing to say, let's go in-house, and it's another, how do we do it properly?
Right.
And then subsequently, the people that are actually going to run that in-house agency, hiring the right ones and making sure that there's momentum to keep it moving forward. Because just like an agency outside of the client realm, right? Like, so a standalone agency, you go through peaks and valleys.
Sure.
Like, agencies contract, they expand, there's turnover, leadership is bad, it's good.
Yeah.
Agencies go out of business, so maintaining quality at an agency is very difficult, because the only thing really that you have are the people. And so the people move on, and you don't replace quality people with the people of the same quality, or to have a vision or a way to articulate and make it happen. But so that's a testament, really, I would imagine, to whoever initially said, let's do this, but let's do it right, and then hiring the right people to execute that vision.
They really, they got it right. And they got it right in a way that made me spoiled for every place that I went that followed, because most places, frankly, do not have that same level of commitment. Now, this is what I tell to a lot of my friends in creative who are thinking about making the leap from agencies to corporate side. I say to all of them, just do your homework. There are really good in-house agencies, like the in-house agency at Lenovo down in Raleigh, North Carolina, like CVS up in Rhode Island, like Apple, like Chobani. All those places are really, really good in-house. Boeing has a really good in-house agency. But
Popcorn at Universal Resorts in Orlando.
They placed not is it Hilton? I think Hilton down in McLean, Virginia. They also have a very good one.
I know a creative director
MGM
down there.
and
Yeah.
MGM has a great one.
Mhm.
But for all of those places, there are probably 3 or 4 or 5 that end up just being kind of fast churn production studios where there's no strategy and it's just like do what I say and make it sound the way I want it to sound, and I like that word and I hate this color, and you run into that that unfortunate kind of
Well, there's a,
environment.
there's, I always go back to the bell curve, and that's why I'm humble about being a strategist, because strategists are no different than any other profession out there.
Hmm.
There's some that are stellar, most are, competent, and then there's
Right,
some that are horrible.
right.
And it's the same thing with, there's a lot of brands out there that are just nondescript. They're blah. They
Yes,
may or may not have, they may have an outside agency, but they hire, because they're a blah brand, they hire a blah agency,
right.
or they have an in-house agency, and because they're a blah brand, they hire, and so they never break out of the pack. They never, they're not the big brands that, it's interesting that the brands that you mentioned, these are leading brands,
They are.
that,
They are.
the Universal Studios of the world, the Prudentials of the world. How many insurance companies are there out there? There's a gazillion of them, but
Right,
most of them are just bang.
right.
Yeah, and the question is, how many of them have in-house agencies and how many of them have just in-house creative departments?
Yeah, and for a lot of them, and that's the thing that, and that's the other thing that I would say. It's like, when people think in terms of in-house agency, they think, oh, well, we'll just have, creatives. We'll have like a creative studio. And there's so much more to a really good in-house agency than that.
Yeah.
You have to have great project management, certainly. It really helps to have great strategists. It really helps to have people that really know how to like manage your internal clients. Like all that stuff helps. And media has become so important. Like I don't understand, frankly, how you can say, well, we're just going to do this great creative, but we're not thinking about media. Well, what do you mean you're not thinking about media? How are you going to get your message to the right person, at the right time? So again, I just felt like Prudential was really, it was really an eye opener for me um, how far ahead of what I had heard about in-house agencies to be, how much more advanced they were than that.
So Mark, you said that you were spoiled by your experience at Prudential in a good way, I'm
Yes,
saying.
yes.
Um, how did that affect your attitude toward the other corporate entities where you worked after Prudential?
I think that it made me disillusioned
Hmm.
and disappointed because I thought that again, I frequently say to people, and it's part of my penance, and part of the way I kind of punish myself, that I left Prudential way too soon and for the wrong reasons. And subsequently, when I would go to these other places kind of expecting it to kind of operate the same way, it just wouldn't, and it couldn't, because their cultures were very different. They had different businesses, they had different cultures, and that meant they ran in different ways. And I say to people all the time, I say, I didn't realize, I would frequently see in job descriptions for very large organizations, a large, highly, is that a cat?
Yeah, that's my executive assistant. She usually joins us for the conversation. She's here now.
I never knew what a large, highly matrixed and complex organization was. And then I discovered, oh, you mean it's just a euphemism for a bureaucracy. Oh, now I see. Now I see. But I think it's just, in some ways, it's just the nature of large organizations. They almost have to operate like governments because they're so massive. Which is fine, except that it really becomes challenging to kind of navigate a landscape like that and get the things that you need,
Yeah.
because I think the instinct is to say no, not let's see how we can make it work.
Yeah. The older I get, the less patience I have for bureaucracy. And I feel like, unfortunately, both in the private sector and in the public sector, we're all getting choked off by these giant bureaucracies. There's nothing creative about them. There's nothing, inspirational about them.
Mm.
And so, it's not surprising when you have, you know, people that are iconoclastic like Elon Musk doing things completely differently and doing achieving things that nobody else can achieve because they just don't think in that bureaucratic,
Right.
you take, and, I've worked with big institutional clients before, and and I still do. And it's just, it's a sapping effect to creativity.
You just have to understand, the culture that you're walking into and what that means for you as an individual, right? And so that, and that's why I say, for my especially my younger friends that are thinking about going to clients, I really advise them just think carefully about what they're doing and to choose carefully, and to, for God's sake, don't let your decision be like motivated solely by money, although it's easy to make that kind of unfortunate calculus. But you really want to be at a place that's really going to allow you to thrive as a creative, if that's really where your heart is, and all the money in the world won't fix that if that's not what you can get.
So that leads me to the question: when you made these leaps from Prudential to other organizations, and you were at Chase when I met you in 2018,
Mhm.
has that influenced how you feel about the corporate world now? I mean, you mentioned, I think, quite presciently that the agency model is coming under suspicion now.
Yeah,
A lot of creatives are saying, do I really want to, become a work, that kind of a workhorse constantly on the job,
yeah, yeah.
to cut my teeth, or can I do I have opportunities in the corporate side? Are you influenced by your experience to that perception, to that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, if you want to express yourself creatively, and have passion for your work, and really want to kind of be at kind of the zenith of creativity, I think agencies still kind of hold that mantle, but I think that there are other alternatives now. And I think that there are a couple of things that have made that happen. One is that, the influence of the growth of technology. Like, people have now looked at places like Google and Facebook and, the other tech companies, and said, hey, I can do some really interesting creative stuff there. And I mentioned those two off the top of my head, but of course there's WeWork, Airbnb, like, you name it. Like, a lot of these places do have in-house, kind of in creative marketing organizations that will allow you to be just as creative and do work that's just as interesting, but maybe treat you a little bit more humanely. I do think that, if you are a creative, and especially once you've gotten a few years under your belt, you just have a lot more options now. And I think that, is corporate one of those options? It can be. You just have to choose carefully. And really, the best thing that you can do, if it's at all possible, is to talk to somebody that's already working there and has been there for a while, because they're going to give you the unvarnished truth about the place. When you go into any interview situations, like dating, everybody is kind of on their best behavior.
Right.
But you find out once you're inside what it's really like. And if you have friends, or somebody that you can kind of check in with and say, hey, what's it really like to work at XYZ company? Can you give me the pros and cons? Then you can make an informed decision. But I think it's especially now, and Howard, you probably know this as well as anybody. But in-house agencies are definitely on the upswing in terms of,
Yeah.
the number of organizations that are forming them. And you have organizations like, the A&A in-house agency committee, and IHAF up in Boston, the trade organization, that are really helping these in-house agencies to be very successful and really good at what they do. And by the way, are showing their financial value to the organizations as well, which is probably the most
Yeah,
important thing.
exactly. I mean, ANA has at least one or two workshops for agencies that focuses entirely on how do you manage the transition, how do you build an in-house agency. It's become an important part of our world. We can't escape that now.
Mm.
Definitely.
It occurs to me that I've never thought about it because I'm not a creative, but that if you're a creative thinking about going to an in-house agency, that you would evaluate it the same way you would evaluate a traditional agency, which
Yeah,
is to look at the work and
yeah,
say, is this work that I want to, and when you interview, say, show me the best work that you guys have done. Because
Right.
they may tell you, look, we're not proud of the work we're doing, that's why we're hiring. And that's a reasonable answer, right? If they don't have great work to show. But if they have great work, then that's a good sign that, you'll be joining a team that it'll be fulfilling to work on, at least from a
Yeah.
creative standpoint.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
because even though, yes, I agree that there we've had these pendulum swings toward in-house in the past, and a lot of big brands, to a lot of pomp and circumstance, have created in-house agencies only a few years later to fire their in-house agency and go out of house again.
Yeah.
So this is a pendulum swing type of thing,
It
but
is.
but it's not always motivated by the best of reasons. Sometimes it's just they see it as because they see their out of house agency as a cost center. And so they say, if we're going to have a cost center, we might as well have it in house
Mhm.
and it'll be cheaper.
Right.
So it's not necessarily with an eye toward getting better
No.
communications, just cheaper communications. So,
Yes.
um, and I'm not saying that to disparage all in-house agencies, because we've been saying, some
Right.
in-house agencies do amazing work.
Right.
I don't know if they're still in-house, but I know that Target had an in-house agency for a bunch of years, and they did a lot of great work
They did.
Yeah.
for Target.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think they're one of the ones that no longer has an in-house agency, but I'm not
Yeah.
100% sure. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah, yeah. I think that in addition to what we've been talking about, and what you say is very true, Henry, in terms of, a lot of organizations look at it as a purely dollars and cents kind of decision, which I always think is somewhat short-sighted. But the other thing that I think corporate organizations have to do, and this is really something that has to be kind of socialized throughout the organization, is that an in-house agency, in my opinion, in order for it to be effective, has to have a degree of autonomy, right? They can't feel as if they will be threatened, or their jobs will be threatened if they disagree, with their internal clients, or that they are really under the thumb of those clients. If that's the case, then you don't really have an agency. You have a studio, and you're just saying to the studio, well, just do what I want, and here are the directions, and here's the checklist, and off you go.
Mark, you said something earlier on about how impressed you were with the quality of the briefs that you got when you were at Prudential. I want to come back to that because, when I go out and do my training, I've traveled all around the country doing the training.
Yeah.
Universally, and this might have been true when you were in New York and we met,
Mhm.
creatives complain about the quality of briefs.
Yeah.
Whether they work at agencies, or whether they're freelancers, or
Always.
whether they're. So when I hear you praise the quality of the briefs that you received from the strategists at Prudential, number one, I'm gratified, and number two, I'm skeptical. Talk more about what was your criteria? How would you, when you say they were good briefs, what do you mean?
For me, the quality of a brief kind of begins and ends with how good is the customer insight. And because once I have that, then I know what to do, right? I know what motivation or what emotion is driving somebody's behavior, be it purchase behavior or be it refusal to purchase behavior, whatever it is. If I have the insight, I can kind of use that as a launch pad to create a really effective communication. And the guys that we had, and
You mean telling you that you need to increase sales by 10% isn't what
sorry,
I knew that was coming.
oddly enough, Henry, no, go figure.
Yeah.
But you alluded to it earlier, when you spoke about the quality of the people, and they just hired really well. They hired really well. It was a tight team. They hired really well. They were very disciplined. They were extremely collaborative. You could have a discussion with. I feel like I spent more time with the strategists almost than I did with my own team. It was just that kind of organization.
That's praise indeed.
But
I
but that's what made it work.
I just joked about, putting a business goal in a creative brief, which obviously has no reason to be there, because the creative says, okay, you need to grow by 10%. Well, what the hell what do I do with that?
Right.
You can't do anything with that. But
it's a copy point, Henry.
But to me, I think that, and as you were talking earlier, I kind of had this thought, and for all the attention that we give to an insight or to a single-minded proposition or to a target description, I
Mhm.
think probably the most important role of a brief is to articulate what the communication problem to solve
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
right?
it's true. Yeah,
If I tell you we need to increase sales by 10%, that doesn't tell you anything. But if I tell you consumers are afraid to buy our brand because in the past we've had quality concerns that we've since fixed. Now all of a sudden, okay, we need to be reassuring.
right,
We need to provide some sort of guarantee. We need
right,
to make sure that people have confidence or that they give us a second chance. We need
right.
to be honest and acknowledge the past. Like those are different creative routes that you can
Mhm,
take
mhm.
once you acknowledge, like, this is what's going on. This is what the real problem is. Sometimes the problem, I think one of the most overused things is awareness.
Yeah,
I
Uh,
see awareness as we have to increase awareness. It's like, well, 99% of people know your brand exists.
mhm.
You don't have an awareness problem. You might have a consideration problem.
Or a caring problem.
And that's and consideration is usually one of the, because the reason people aren't considering you, it could be infinitely long. Like but the main reason, it could be very different from brand A to brand B to brand
Yeah,
C, why
yeah,
they're not considering you. Like they
yeah.
may not be considering you because your competition is out shouting you, or because I mentioned they have a perception of poor quality
Mhm.
or they have a perception that you're too expensive,
Right,
right?
right,
So
right.
I think articulating the problem
Yeah,
uh, and putting it in communications terms is probably the most important aspect of the brief in its totality.
yeah, yeah. I wonder what, when JetBlue launched in this country, I wonder what the brief was that led to the work, because the work was really good. And I think that JetBlue, at least at first, I'm not so sure about now, but at first, very differentiated from other airlines in terms of the way they spoke, in terms of the way that they behaved, and in terms, I think, most importantly, of the way they really put themselves into the shoes of their passengers. And as a result, I think people like the airline because they're like, hey, you're kind of like me. So that means you get me. That means I'm going to enjoy flying you.
Yeah,
Um,
it's an interesting industry because there were so many of these kind of legacy um airlines, right, that
mhm.
were created during a time when the airline industry was highly regulated. The routes were so that there was a lot of profit built in, so you could have a lot of perks, right? Like
Right, right.
traveling, and air travel was new, right?
Yeah,
So you had all this, being on the plane was part of the trip.
right,
Now it's
right.
like, now it's become like a Greyhound bus, and it's really, you just want to get to the destination, and but JetBlue was created already in that post deregulation era, so they kind of knew and to me it's not just about their communication, but about how they initially organized the whole company
Right.
around kind of what are the friction points for
Yes,
travelers, and
exactly.
let's try to eliminate some of those friction points. More than the advertising, what I remember was reading a story about JetBlue about how they, at least in the beginning, they only bought one type of aircraft.
Hmm.
And the reason they did that was because they were going to save all kinds of costs. Like they would only need one kind of jet bridge.
Right.
They would only need mechanics that were certified in that one kind of aircraft, and
Yeah.
pilots that were certified. Like it eliminated a bunch of complexity that these big legacy carriers had that they didn't have to have, so that they could pass those savings on to consumers and still make money, where the big guys were like, you know cutting benefit. You're not going to get a drink anymore, you're not going to get
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
meal anymore, whatever. So
Yeah.
that's a great example of
and to
understanding the consumer desire and really going after it.
and today, JetBlue is plummeted in Wall Street Journal's annual list of most successful or popular airlines.
I got to tell you, so this is just a personal anecdote. So I recently had to book a flight to the Dominican Republic, and I was trying to use JetBlue points and trying to use their site and their app to do it. And it was such a horrific experience. And I was so frustrated by everything about trying to plan, that I was actually texting. First of all, you can never get anybody on the phone anymore, but I'm texting back and forth with the customer service representative. And in a fit of pique, I said, I will never fly this airline again. And then I added, I said, I know you guys just acquired Spirit. Are you guys now Spirit with just different colors? Because that's how far it feels like they've fallen.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds like a great challenge for a new marketer and a new agency to come in.
Yeah.
and
It
try to-
does.
Yeah.
try
You know,
to, clean it up.
as a creative, one of the things I ask during my training is, especially the kind of workshop where I met Mark, because those workshops that are sponsored by the ANA are free to members of the ANA, and they send 2, 3, 4 people from their company. So there's a wide variety of ANA members. So there's a lot of industries represented. So I asked the question, how many of you think you work on a boring brand? And it surprises me that 25%, 30% raise their hand.
Mm.
And I say, I asked, I said, why do you think it's a boring brand? And I get different answers. As a creative, I say, there's no such thing as a boring brand. There's
really
there's only boring advertising. And the more the brand is perceived to be boring, the more I want to work on it, because I want to make it sexy. I want to make
Well,
it
that's
fun.
what, that's what I was
going
going to say. Rescuing a brand that's in trouble, to me, is one of the most noble things that we can do in this industry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I go back to, I've mentioned this before. At some point in a Facebook group for strategists, I was able to obtain the brand strategy deck that Wyden Kennedy presented to Old Spice, like back in 2006.
Oh man.
And
Really?
it's a piece of strategic gold, like the way that they looked at the problem. And then you look at all the success that Old Spice has had since then. And and to me,
And that
that's
was that was a dying brand.
it was
dude.
a
Yeah.
dead brand. It was literally a brand that was going nowhere. And
Yeah.
the interesting thing was that Axe had launched in the United States like a couple of
Right.
years before,
Right.
and they were doing like this great advertising. They were
Yep.
eating up all this market share in
Yep.
men's grooming and men's care products.
Yeah.
And like the people at Old Spice were smart enough to realize, hey, there's an opportunity here for us if we play our cards right. And they had
Yeah.
a pitch, and Wyden Kennedy came, and Old Spice is what it is today because of Wyden Kennedy. So
And
Yeah.
it's an amazing success story. It really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. Is
it's-
there a brief buried within that strategy deck?
it's more of a brand strategy.
Mhm.
I could share it with you, Howard.
I'd
It's
love to see
interesting
it.
because I've stolen the format and used it several times very effectively for clients and to win pitches. So
Well, I asked because Henry, and I don't remember if I've mentioned it to you, Mark, but I haven't launched it officially, and I'm not going to launch it officially for some time, but I now have on my website the Creative Brief Archive, and I'm starting to assemble a
Ah,
collection of creative
wow.
briefs
That would be
by
really
brand
interesting.
and by agency.
That would be
And it's a small collection, but every library starts out with one shelf, and I basically got one shelf.
right.
And I hope to hit up some of my friends in the industry. That, even though it's not an official brief, Henry, might find a place, in the archive.
I'll email it to you when we hang up.
Okay.
I
So,
had
so
a-
Mark,
Yeah.
you have another story you want to tell, Mark?
I was just, I was just gonna, I was just listening to what Henry was saying about, and what you were saying about boring brands. And I remember I had a boss early on in my tenure at Digitas. I had a boss who said, if you want loyal customers, then be a loyal brand.
Mhm.
And I thought that was a really kind of cogent observation, and one that was really powerful. And it just says, you know what? Like, get out of your own head and get into the consumer's heads, and then you'll be fine. But you got to do it. You got to get out of your own
Yeah.
head.
It's about walking a mile in another person's shoes. If you don't have empathy and understanding, you can't sell to them. You just
Well,
can't.
that brings me to an idea that I thought we would get to in talking about in-house agencies and in-house creative departments. And I wonder what your thought is on it. I feel that one of the dangers of in-house is myopia.
It can be.
Marketers have a tendency to be myopic in general. And then when you
Mhm.
have the in-house agency, like you said, that's basically under the thumb of the marketer. The idea of like, you know, I talk about a lot, in defending traditional out-of-house agencies, I say, listen, big corporations have legal departments, right? They have in-house counsel, but when they have to litigate, they go out of house, because litigating is a different
deal.
animal, and you want the best litigators, and the best litigators usually aren't the best in-house counsel or corporate counsel, right? And so I say, you know, an out-of-house agency, particularly a good one like the Shia Days of the world, the Wyden Kennedys of the world, right? Those agencies are specialists at what they do, and one of the things they bring is outside perspective.
Right.
Not just on the industry, but on the consumer, on the cultural zeitgeist, everything that involves advertising. And I'm afraid that some of that is easily lost in an in-house environment.
It can be, depending on what on how committed the culture of the organization is to diversity of thought. And not diversity as in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but diversity in terms of, you know, entertaining different perspectives and different viewpoints. Because an in-house agency, you know, their knowledge, their deep knowledge of a brand is actually a two-edged sword. It can be myopia, like you say, you know, where you're only really kind of seeing, you know, the positive or the things that you've been told about the brand by the organization. But it also means that you're close to the brand in a way that an outside agency would not be. And that is in some ways, as a matter of fact, the guy who runs the in-house agency at Boeing, I was at an IHAF conference one year, and he talked about it as being a superpower, and it is. You know, if you are, you know, really well versed in the brand, but also creatively you're really strong as well, then that's really a real advantage. And I think that ideally, and again, I keep bringing up Prudential because it is the model of how to do this right. Their in-house agency, far from being looked down upon by their external agency, which was Droga 5, those two entities worked very well collaboratively together. And the in-house team, because some of the products were actually fairly technical and fairly sophisticated, knew things that the external agency just didn't know because they didn't have that kind of deep knowledge. But because they worked together so well, it didn't matter. The work didn't suffer. The work was enhanced because of what they each brought to the table.
It's interesting that you mentioned Droga 5, because and I don't want to go into that rabbit hole, but Droga 5 was acquired by one of the consulting firms. I think it was Accenture.
Yeah.
So now they're not a traditional standalone agency anymore.
No.
They're part of a consulting firm. So it's fascinating how the industry morphs. But I do think, getting back to strategy and in-house, that it is frankly the role of the strategy department to keep the organization aware of the possible myopia and like fight against it, because it's the strategist role really to have his finger on the pulse of the pop culture, what's going on competitively, what's going on outside of the walls, and to be the eyes, ears, and voice of the consumer inside. Because I think the biggest problem marketers have is they spend all day, every day thinking about their brand, and consumers, even consumers that buy and use their brand, don't give their brand any thought at all. And so there's a big mismatch between, like, we're going to put this commercial, we're going to scrutinize every word on it, and like consumers may take away three thoughts, three fleeting things from the commercial. So you can't look at it like everything that you're putting out there in the world is going to be scrutinized by consumers. I like to say you're really painting for consumers a impressionistic painting, and each commercial is like a brush stroke, and it's never going to look beautiful up close. But when you back up, you might get a general picture of what the brand is about. Right.
I downloaded something or did a screen capture of something I saw on LinkedIn today or yesterday, and it's 10 laws of advertising. Number one is nobody cares.
Number one.
Yeah. So Mark, let me take a wild guess here and say that after you left Prudential prematurely, you know, we all have our career mistakes. I've certainly got mine.
Right.
But would you say that one of the reasons that you were disappointed in the other corporate creative worlds you entered into is because they did not have strategists?
I think that was a large part of it.
Mm,
I was spoiled, I guess, you know.
yeah.
I hate to oversimplify it, but I think I was just spoiled.
Let,
Cautionary tale, ladies and gentlemen. If you're gonna, I mean, if you're gonna do your homework, if you do your homework as Mark is advising, and I worked on the corporate side too. I mean, the last couple of jobs that I had after I left the agency world were on the corporate side. We didn't have strategists, but somehow, you know, I'm a force of nature, I guess, but I had the power to influence the use of a creative brief at the both places where I worked.
Mhm.
But if you don't have strategists, they are a voice of reason. They are
They are.
a lens to prevent myopia.
Yeah.
that brings me to a question. So Howard's a creative who got involved in this world of creative briefs because he felt it was lacking at the agency that he was at. And you met Howard as a creative that was at one of his workshops. What led you to his workshop? Like, why did you as a creative want to do that training? Because I've done workshops at the agency I work at, and I invite everybody in the agency to participate because I think it's important for them to know what I do.
Mhm.
And some of them might want to aspire to do what I do, but the creatives also have their own motivations for wanting to do it. And I'm wondering what yours was.
Completely selfish. I wanted better briefs, and I felt that because I don't remember now because it was a while ago, but I felt if I could pick up a few things from Howard's
You don't remember word for word what I said, Mark?
go figure. Go figure. Howard. I figured if I could pick up a few gems of what Howard said and bring them back to my team, that I would start to get better creative briefs. That was really my sole motivation. Because obviously, I mean, I was pretty well versed in creative briefs at that point, and what made good ones and what made not so good ones. But I felt I didn't feel especially confident about my ability to transmit that information to my coworkers necessarily.
The reason I enjoy having creatives when I hold a workshop is precisely because of that. One is
Mhm.
I think that when I show them behind the curtain,
Mhm.
they appreciate more what I do,
Yeah.
but in some of them, I think they have an understanding then that they can provide input that will help me. And
Right.
it's we start to have a more philosophical conversation
Mhm.
rather than just a business transaction of here's your brief, now you should bring me creative. All of a sudden now we're talking about this thing about what motivates consumers, what are real communication goals, you know, what's a motivating single-minded proposition. So
Right.
I like that dialogue. And the last reason is there are some creatives who frankly should be in the strategy or
That
could be strategists.
absolutely.
And sometimes I've not personally at the agencies I've been at, but like at the Miami Ad School, I've
Mhm.
taught strategy students that had come from the creative side and said, you know what, I was an art director or I was a copywriter, and what I realized was that what I really liked was strategy.
Strategy.
And
Yeah.
so I think that, you know, sometimes we get pigeonholed into our roles, and I think
Absolutely.
that it's a good thing. I've mentioned many times the best creatives I've worked with have had very strong strategic minds. In
Mhm.
fact, the legends of the business, the Bill Bernbachs, the David Ogilvy's of the world,
Yeah.
they were businessmen,
They
and they
were.
were strategic thinkers. They
Yeah.
weren't, even though they were both copywriters, that
Yeah.
was their trade,
Yeah.
but they didn't limit themselves to just copy. You
No.
know, how many copywriters out there have good business minds and could run an entire business? That's what
Mhm.
Bernbach and Ogilvy did.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, I could tell Mark that we could keep this conversation going a long time because we've got a lot of common points, but I want to be respectful of your time.
Thank
So
you.
Henry and I are grateful that you could share some of your thoughts and your wisdom and your advice. Thank you for being on the Brief Brothers, Mark Williams.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it, Howard. And I will
Thank
be
you.
in touch with you again soon, my friend. Henry, it was great meeting you, and
Pleasure.
nice talking to you.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.
Bye.